The cold in the Blackwood Preserve had a particular way of settling into your bones, not just chilling the skin, but leaching the heat from the core of your existence. It was mid-November. The woods were turning from vibrant decay into skeletal grey, and the silence was usually absolute, a crushing, suffocating blanket of isolation that was both the reason I loved this job and the reason others refused it. But today, the silence was broken. It wasn't the sound of the wind or a falling tree, or even the distant familiar groan of a logging truck struggling up a ridge miles away. It was a rhythmic, persistent vibration, a deep, throbbing hum that belonged entirely to the world of asphalt, concrete, and frantic urban movement. A sound that had no business existing 8 miles into Sector Gamma 9, a sector so remote we usually marked it on the grid, only to confirm it had not yet been swallowed by the surrounding wilderness. It was an engine running. I killed the ATV instantly, the abrupt silence of my own machine amplifying the foreign thrumming sound. My heart rate immediately spiked, kicking the adrenaline into my system, sharp and metallic. 20 years as a park ranger, and I'd encountered everything from misplaced millionaire hikers convinced they were dying of exposure to sophisticated illegal meth labs hidden beneath camouflage netting. But this sound, this heavy internal combustion heartbeat, echoing through the dense frozen woods, defied every logical explanation in my procedural manual. I pulled my service rifle from its scabbard, checked the safety, and moved forward on foot. The ground beneath my worn leather boots was a mix of frozen mud and brittle leaf litter, crunching softly with every deliberate step. I kept low, moving parallel to a narrow deer trail that followed the faint but steady sound. The air smelled of frozen hemlock, wet moss, and something else now, something chemical and hot, the unmistakable scent of burning diesel and lubrication oil. The engine wasn't just running, it was idling, a low, steady frequency suggesting a massive machine patiently waiting for instructions. The trees began to thin slightly as I approached a small natural clearing often used by elk during the deepest winter months. And there it was. The color hit me first, a blinding, aggressive yellow, a violent splash of urban industrial pigment that cut through the endless monochrome of the late autumn forest like a physical wound. It was impossible to miss, impossible to reconcile with the surroundings. It was a full-sized 40-foot American school bus. It sat angled sharply into the clearing, its massive front bumper slightly buried into the soft, root-tangled earth. Saplings the diameter of my wrist were snapped off or bent double along its flanks, indicating a recent, rather forceful arrival. The sheer scale of the machine was terrifying in that setting. It was a metal whale beached in an ocean of trees, and the engine was running. I took a position behind a thick stand of fir, settling the butt of the rifle against my shoulder. My mind was scrambling, trying to force this spectacle into one of the known categories of backcountry anomaly. Logging crew? No, they use specialized forest machinery, usually green or faded red. Hunters? Too big, too much effort, wrong vehicle entirely. Hikers? Absolutely not. This was an act of deliberate, massive penetration into the protected interior, and it made no sense. I focused on the logistical impossibility. The nearest road capable of handling this kind of weight, the old Route 21 fire trail, was 8 miles behind me. The ground leading here was choked with boulders, narrow ravines, and dense second-growth timber. How had it navigated that terrain? Did it fly? I circled wide, maintaining cover, seeking the telltale sign of its passage. I expected a rutted catastrophe, a mile-long trench carved into the earth by its massive tires. But the tracks stopped short. It wasn't a gradual entry. It looked as though the bus had materialized, or perhaps been dropped from a great height, and then driven the final 50 yards into the clearing. The area immediately surrounding the bus was a mess of churned soil and snapped underbrush, suggesting a sudden deceleration and violent repositioning. But before that 50-yard mark, the earth was pristine, disturbed only by deer hoofprints and my own ATV tracks from earlier sweeps. The tire treads visible in the mud near the bus were deep and heavy, the distinctive pattern of commercial-grade rubber, but they didn't continue backward. They simply began where the woods thickened again. This wasn't just a vehicle abandoned off-road. This was a vehicle placed with impossible precision deep within the woods. I lowered the rifle just slightly, my skepticism temporarily outweighing my fear. Perhaps it was a highly specialized all-terrain military prototype disguised as a school bus for some obscure training exercise. But that explanation felt hollow. Military vehicles usually come with military personnel, and I saw no signs of life. I spent 5 agonizing minutes scrutinizing the exterior. The windows were all slightly tinted, reflecting the cold, grey sky and the skeletal trees, making the interior impossible to assess from a distance. The yellow paint was standard issue, faded in parts with a layer of grime indicating substantial use. There were no distinguishing school district names, no specific numbers painted on the sides, just the generic black lettering above the windshield. School bus. The exhaustion pipe was steadily emitting a thin, pale blue plume of smoke that rose straight up into the still air, visible above the roofline. The sound, that continuous, relentless thrum, 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 was the only thing moving in the entire landscape. It was the sound of energy being expended uselessly, fuel being consumed for no purpose. I began my approach, slow and low, moving directly toward the driver's side. The closer I got, the more the scale of the bus overwhelmed me. It felt enormous, monumental, looming over the stunted pines. I focused on the wheels. They were coated in mud, wet but not frozen solid, meaning it hadn't been here for days. It had arrived either late last night or early this morning. My hand instinctively went to the radio on my shoulder harness, but I hesitated. Reporting a suspicious occupied vehicle that turned out to be a simple, if highly misplaced, drunk driver or a group of lost campers was one thing. Reporting a running, abandoned 40-foot school bus that appeared to have teleported 8 miles into protected wilderness was another. I needed better data before I alerted command and initiated a full-scale regional panic. I reached the left front corner of the bus, pressing my back against the cold metal, using the bulk of the machine as cover. The heat radiating from the engine compartment was intense, a localized pocket of summer in the deep freeze. The mechanical sound was deafening now, vibrating through the metal against my spine, making my teeth ache. I sidled forward, peeking around the front of the bus toward the main entry door, which was situated just behind the front axle on the right side. The door was closed, completely shut. I moved along the side window line, peering hard through the tinted glass. I cupped my hands around my eyes to cut the reflection. The interior was deep in shadow, rows and rows of yellow vinyl seats, perfectly uniform and eerily empty. No backpacks, no coats, no lunchboxes, no books. Nothing suggesting sudden abandonment. It was clean. Too clean. I paused at the driver's window. The heart of the mystery. The key detail, the one that truly drove the initial spike of panic into my chest, wasn't the running engine, or the impossible location, or the empty interior. It was the driver's side window. It was cranked down, about 2 inches. In the dead center of the Blackwood Preserve, where the temperature was hovering around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, where the wind chill would drive the temperature even lower once I reached the next ridge, someone had left a vehicle running and left the window slightly open. But that wasn't all. A torrent of hot, stale air was pouring out of the gap. The bus's heating system was blasting at full capacity. The air smelled thick, heavily perfumed with old vinyl dust and a very faint, almost sweet odor that I couldn't immediately identify, a smell often associated with old gymnasiums or cheap processed food. My logic centers were screaming contradictions at me. If the driver had abandoned the bus temporarily, perhaps to scout a location or relieve themselves, why leave the engine running and the heat blasting while simultaneously cracking the window in freezing temperatures? It was a massive waste of fuel, a bizarre inefficiency. It implied either profound haste or profound distraction. I raised the rifle again, holding it loosely, ready but not aiming, and reached out to the cold metal of the door handle. It was then I noticed the one item left on the dashboard. It was placed directly in the center of the dash, easily visible through the open window gap. A small piece of paper, folded roughly in half, but visible enough that I could see a splash of crayon color on its exposed side. It was a child's drawing, crude, vibrant, and completely out of place. I lowered the rifle, resting it on my forearm, and edged closer to the open window. The smell of the hot air intensified. I leaned my ear toward the opening, trying to distinguish sounds inside the cabin over the roar of the idling diesel engine. The vibration against my face was intense, a deep chest resonance, and then I heard it. A faint, repetitive sound, mechanical and scratchy, struggling to compete with the engine's rumble. It wasn't the sound of an adult driver or a radio show, or even the hiss of the air brakes. It sounded like an old magnetic tape loop. A cassette player, perhaps, placed near the front, broadcasting into the empty rows of seats. I strained my hearing, filtering out the constant thrum of the engine. The voice was high-pitched, childlike, distorted by the poor quality of the recording and the intervening noise. It was repeating a short phrase over and over again, like a mantra played on repeat. I leaned in, dangerously close, needing to confirm the words before I committed to breaching the vehicle. The heat pouring out was stifling, almost painful against my cold face. And then the phrase resolved itself, clear enough to register in the sudden, horrifying clarity of my trained mind. Wait here. Don't move. Wait here. Don't move. Wait here. Don't move. It was a simple instruction, delivered by a child's voice, played on endless loop inside a running, empty 40-foot bus that had no physical way of reaching this impossible location. The entire scene twisted violently in my perception. It wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. It wasn't just a logistical puzzle. This was premeditation. This was deliberate. Someone had driven or somehow maneuvered this bus deep into the remote woods, put a small child's voice on repeat, left the engine running with the heat blasting and simply vanished. Vanished, leaving no tracks leading away. Vanished, leaving the machine consuming fuel, waiting for a passenger who had already been told to wait. I reached for the driver's door handle again, my gloved hand hesitating a fraction of an inch away from the cold metal. My professional training warred with a gut instinct of pure dread. If I open that door, I cross a line. I commit to whatever nightmare is locked inside this yellow box. This wasn't just a crime scene. It felt like a staged event. I needed to see what was behind that tape loop. I needed to know if the bus was truly empty, or if there was something or someone else hidden in the rows of shadows. I needed to know why the air outside felt so unnaturally still, the silence so profoundly complete, while the heart of this machine continued its tireless, pointless duty. This was only the beginning. The Blackwood Preserve had just presented me with a secret that felt heavier than the forest itself, a mystery of metal, isolation, and a repeated promise. I was about to find out exactly why a child had been instructed to wait here and where the driver had gone. I gripped the rifle tighter, inhaling the thick, oily air from the exhaust. I had to get inside. The first step was lifting that heavy, cold latch. The sheer aggressive sound of the idling engine was an insult to the absolute silence of the deep woods, a buzzing, vibrating intrusion that settled deep in my chest cavity and refused to dissipate. I had circled the vehicle twice, noting the lack of major damage. No scraped paint on the side, no bent mirror, just mud caked high onto the wheel wells and the lower chassis, suggesting a long, difficult, perhaps even reckless journey through terrain that was never meant to sustain 50,000 pounds of steel and rubber. The smell of hot diesel and oil was becoming oppressive, mingling with the sharp, clean scent of pine and damp earth, creating a chemical stench that felt wrong, unnatural. Every instinct honed over 20 years of patrolling this wilderness screamed at me, "Get away, this is wrong, you are not supposed to be here." But the job, the fundamental duty to protect and assist, locked my feet to the ground. My radio was useless. I was too deep, the canyon walls swallowing any attempt at communication, leaving me utterly alone with this massive metallic monument to a vanished population. The knowledge that the heat radiating from the engine block meant fuel was being consumed at an alarming rate added a ticking clock element to the terror. How long until the tank ran dry? Hours? Maybe less, given the relentless nature of the idling. I finally reached the front entry door, the folding pneumatic mechanism that marked the official threshold of this disturbing mystery. The glass was opaque with dust and condensation on the inside, preventing any clear initial view, forcing me to rely entirely on what I could perceive through the grime. I hesitated, my hand hovering near the manual release latch, a bright yellow handle recessed just above the steps. This was the moment of commitment. Once I opened that door, I was stepping into the core of the problem, trading the relative safety of the known exterior for the unknown, suffocating interior. I took a deep breath, the diesel fumes burning my throat, and grasped the latch. It was cold under my glove. I pulled down firmly. The resulting noise was instantaneous and deeply unsettling. A violent, sustained shh as the air brakes released, followed by a heavy mechanical clunk as the folding doors swung inward, grinding slightly against years of accumulated grime. It was the sound of a sleeping mechanical giant suddenly stirring, and the effect was magnified tenfold by the surrounding stillness of the forest. The interior air that rushed out to meet me was stale, humid, and heavy with the pervasive smell of forgotten lives, dried sweat, old synthetic fabrics, faint traces of spilled milk, and the metallic tang of machine oil, all baked together by the heat from the engine and the afternoon sun. It was an atmosphere I immediately associated with the end of a long, miserable school day, only intensified and preserved in this strange vacuum. I climbed the 2 narrow steps, ducking slightly under the lower doorframe. The immediate shock was the state of the interior. It was completely empty yet profoundly utilized. This was not a quick stop. This was an abandonment. My gaze swept quickly, methodically from the driver's area, past the long rows of mustard yellow vinyl seats, all the way to the emergency exit at the very rear. The entire bus was bathed in a diffuse, grainy light filtering through the dust-coated windows. The dust motes danced lazily in the beams, giving the air a thick, palpable texture like powdered silence. The floor was a mess. It was streaked with mud, the same dark reddish clay I had tracked in, but mixed with an astonishing array of small, innocuous debris. Crumpled homework papers bearing crayon markings, a half-chewed pencil stub near the aisle, a single mismatched sneaker, a child's size, blue and white, laces trailing. And beneath the 5th row on the passenger side, a brightly colored plastic lunchbox, sealed shut, its contents unknown, and now undoubtedly spoiled. The sheer volume of these abandoned artifacts was chilling. People, or rather children, don't simply leave these things behind in a planned evacuation or a simple drop-off. These items spoke of disruption, of being forced to rise and move with such immediate urgency that the simple act of gathering personal belongings was impossible. I moved slowly down the aisle, the heavy tread of my boots sounding ridiculously loud on the ribbed rubber floor. I deliberately avoided touching anything, acutely aware that this entire scene was now a crime scene, or at the very least, a massive search and rescue operation in the making, assuming I could ever get a signal out. Each seat was a tableau of sudden departure. One seat had a small folded blanket, neatly placed on the vinyl, suggesting perhaps the passenger had been sleeping or resting, suddenly roused. The next had a textbook, World History Grade 7 EQ, open and face down, the spine bent sharply as if dropped mid-sentence. I paused by the window line, running the back of my gloved hand over the glass. The condensation vanished, revealing the dense, intimidating wall of conifers just feet away. The sense of isolation hit harder from the inside. They hadn't parked in a clearing. They had burrowed into the thickest part of the woods accessible, an impossible feat. I focused on the driver's compartment. This area held the key to who brought the bus here, and perhaps why. The air around the large, worn steering wheel felt heavier, weighted by responsibility. The ignition switch was in the on position naturally, confirming what the throbbing noise outside already told me. The keys, however, were not in the ignition. They were dangling from a cheap plastic keyring hook, clipped onto the visor directly above the driver's head. This was unusual. A professional driver, stopping for any short duration, would typically leave the keys in the ignition or at least on the dash. Clipping them up suggests an intention to return immediately, or perhaps a deliberate attempt to safeguard them before leaving. But why run the engine if you're guarding the keys? The fuel consumption was an act of deliberate waste, or, more darkly, a requirement for something. On the flat dash console, nestled right next to the air gauge cluster, was the logbook. It was an official-looking, standardized Department of Transportation ledger, bound in cheap green cardstock. It was open. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, repetitive thud matching the low-frequency drone of the idling engine. I leaned in, not touching the book itself, relying only on the beam of my flashlight. Even in the relative daylight, the corners of the bus were pitch black. The last entry was dated 2 days prior to my discovery, which meant the bus had been running, abandoned, for at least 48 hours, potentially far longer. That realization hit me with the sickening force of a physical blow. 48 hours, maybe more, of continuous running, consuming gallons upon gallons of fuel just waiting. Waiting for what? The driver's name, scrawled in a tired, looping hand, was Elias T. The route number was marked clearly, 14B. The odometer reading was logged, confirming the bus had driven a staggering distance since its last service check, far surpassing the boundaries of its expected suburban route. But the destination entry, the column usually filled with the last stop or expected mileage, was strangely blank for the last recorded run. There was just a smear of ink, as if the pen had slipped or the writer had been interrupted violently. I pulled back, the air thin in my lungs. I needed to document this, to photograph it, but my phone was dead weight without signal. The procedure demanded patience, isolation of evidence, and establishing a perimeter. But the engine was running, and there was the gnawing, horrifying possibility that someone, perhaps injured, perhaps terrified, was still inside this metal prison. I had systematically scanned the front half, focusing on the evidence of sudden evacuation. Now the deepest part of the bus called to me, the shadowy area past the rear wheel well, where the light diminished and the air grew colder, heavier. I moved past the 8th row, my eyes sweeping under the seats, looking for anything that might be hiding. A small foot, a piece of clothing, a pool of liquid. Nothing. The silence from this section was profound, broken only by the distant, resonant roar of the engine. It felt like I was walking into the mouth of a massive acoustic chamber. It was near the back bench, the final row stretching across the width of the bus, that I found the first major pattern interrupt. This wasn't just a dropped item. This was a deliberate placement. Tucked directly under the last seat, where the metal frame met the floor, was a small black object. It was dense, rectangular, and utterly out of place. It wasn't a child's toy, nor a thermos, nor a piece of school equipment. It was high-grade electronics, taped crudely to the underside of the seat frame using heavy-duty grey duct tape, almost identical in color to the steel. I knelt down, the floor sticky with dried residue, and cautiously examined it with my light. It looked like a specialized satellite uplink device, or maybe an extremely sophisticated GPS tracker, far beyond commercial grade. It had no identifying marks I could see immediately, just a single small green LED flickering almost imperceptibly, confirming it was still active, still drawing power from a source I couldn't identify. My mind raced. Why was this here? Surveillance? Tracking? If the bus had been hijacked or commandeered, this device suggested a level of planning and professionalism that contradicted the haphazard, almost panicked way the vehicle had been simply abandoned with the engine running. This wasn't the work of joyriding teenagers or simple opportunists. This suggested a specific, calculated motive. Someone wanted this bus or its contents tracked precisely, and whoever placed it clearly didn't bother to retrieve it during the sudden departure. The discovery fundamentally shifted the nature of the situation from a possible tragic accident or runaway incident to something far more sinister and organized. This bus wasn't lost. It had been placed. I spent several agonizing minutes documenting the position of the device mentally, knowing I couldn't risk handling it yet. I stood up, feeling a knot of pure dread forming in my stomach. The absence of the children was no longer just sad. It was terrifying. They hadn't just gotten off the bus, they had been extracted, and someone highly organized was involved in the logistics. The final piece of the interior puzzle was the emergency exit door at the very back. Unlike the front entrance, this door was often the source of drafts and mechanical issues. I approached it, noting the large red release handle. This door was closed, but the mechanism appeared to be ever so slightly ajar, not fully seated in its locking frame. I reached out, nudging the door gently. It moved with a quiet, sickening squeak, opening just enough to admit a sliver of external light and a gust of cool forest air. And there, pressed into the thick layer of dust that had accumulated on the metal plate of the rear step, were footprints. Not the small, varied treads of numerous children, nor the pattern of my own boots. These were large, deep, and distinct. The aggressive treads of a heavy work boot, singular in pattern, suggesting one or maybe two adults exiting quickly and deliberately through the rear, long after the children had apparently vanished. The prints led directly away from the bus, deeper into the dark, tangled undergrowth of the canyon, dissolving quickly where the pine needles and moss took over. The pattern was clear. The passengers left quickly through the front. The driver, or whoever was controlling the bus, left just as suddenly, but through the rear, taking the keys and leaving behind a sophisticated tracking device, all while ensuring the powerful fuel-guzzling engine continued to idle, generating that constant, defiant drone that was the only thing preventing this metal husk from truly belonging to the dead silence of the forest. The running engine was the last desperate open loop, the ultimate provocation. A signal burning gallons of diesel into the atmosphere, telling anyone who might find it. We were here. We left. And we did it on purpose. I stood between the driver's seat and the empty rows, the silence of the space screaming at me despite the mechanical racket outside. My procedural training had completely failed. This wasn't a search and rescue. This was the beginning of an investigation into a mass disappearance, orchestrated with unnerving precision. I had to get out. I had to find a signal, but the sheer effort it would take to hike back up the canyon in the fading light felt impossible. And if I left the bus, what if the engine finally died? What critical evidence might be lost if that constant flow of power ceased? The suspense was agonizing, a heavy weight pressing me down onto the sticky, dust-covered floor, forcing me to decide what violation of protocol was less dangerous, staying and searching the immediate perimeter, or abandoning the only sign of human presence for miles to seek help that might arrive too late. The pulsing thrum of the engine continued its mantra, run, run, run. And yet, I felt profoundly, terrifyingly paralyzed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing inside a living mechanical tomb, humming a low, persistent note. That note, that deep, unsettling thrum of the running diesel engine, had burrowed itself past my eardrums and settled somewhere cold and hard in my chest. It was the sound of persistence divorced from logic. Every instinct I possessed, every piece of training drilled into me over 2 decades of patrolling this vast, unforgiving wilderness, screamed at me to shut it down. But I hesitated. Shutting off the engine felt like more than just turning a key or flicking a switch. It felt like destroying the only piece of evidence that this impossible scenario was real. What if the second the power ceased? The bus, the items, the memory of the light flickering near the back. What if it all simply vanished? I was operating on pure, irrational fear, disguised as forensic protocol. I moved slowly toward the driver's seat again, pulling off my heavy leather glove just long enough to test the metal of the dashboard. It was warm, surprisingly, almost hot near the primary console. The air inside, though slightly humid, smelled strongly of stale diesel fumes mixed with a faint metallic ozone, the kind of scent you get from highly stressed electrical components. This wasn't the smell of a bus that had been running for 20 minutes. It was the scent of a machine that had been perpetually active, perhaps idled for days, maybe longer, isolated from maintenance and fresh air. I spent the next agonizing minutes meticulously examining the ignition column. The metal casing was intact, no obvious signs of forced entry or hot wiring attempts. But the key slot was empty, completely void. I ran my fingers along the plastic housing, checking the standard hiding spots, under the steering wheel shroud, taped to the column. Nothing. If the engine was running, the circuit was complete. If the keys weren't in the ignition, then someone, or something, had bypassed the entire system, rendering the physical lock utterly meaningless. I glanced back at the seats. The children's possessions, those colorful, mundane signifiers of daily routine, seemed to glow faintly in the shadowed interior. A worn Spider-Man lunchbox, a purple backpack with a dangling unicorn keychain, a slightly crushed picture of a family taped to the back of one seat. Everything organized, everything waiting. I finally leaned across the driver's seat and located the heavy, laminated logbook, tucked securely into a clip beside the gear shift. My breath caught, expecting a manifesto or a sign of foul play. I opened it carefully, noting the crispness of the paper, the standard route sheets taped inside. The routes were local, familiar. The Maple Grove housing tract, the old Mill Road, the elementary school, all within a 10-mile radius of the main trail entrance, yet we were miles beyond that boundary. I flipped past the daily inspection sheets, past the fuel consumption logs, until I reached the recent entries. The last entry was dated 3 days prior. The mileage logged was 187,455. The entry was signed by a familiar name, Mrs. Evelyn Rourke, a driver known for her punctuality and decades of service. The page below was blank. The following pages were blank. 3 days ago, yet the bus felt like it had been sitting here running since the Big Bang. My eyes drifted instinctively to the odometer display, a small digital readout embedded deep in the console. The current mileage display was glowing, bright green against the warm plastic. 187,455. The mileage hadn't changed, not a single digit. The bus had been running. The engine was shaking the floor beneath my boots, consuming diesel, yet according to the official gauge, it hadn't moved an inch since Evelyn Rourke signed off 3 days prior. If the engine was running, even idling, the internal systems should register some movement, some incremental gain in hours or distance, even if minimal. This anomaly wasn't just perplexing, it was physically impossible under standard engineering principles. The dissonance was deafening. I moved past the dashboard, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs, and went straight for the rear emergency exit. My rationale was simple. If they had abandoned the bus, they would have likely left tracks, especially if the children were panicked. But the snow cover here was minimal, largely protected by the dense, low-hanging pines, leaving a dense layer of pine needles and damp earth. I pushed the door open, the heavy mechanism protesting with a loud metallic shriek that briefly overpowered the steady thrum of the engine. The cold outside was a brutal shock after the lukewarm interior. Stepping onto the muddy earth, I circled the bus's perimeter, crouching low, trying to discern anything from the forest floor. The tires were sunk slightly into the soft earth, indicating the vehicle had been stationary for some time. I followed the faint line of disturbance the tires made, confirming the bus had driven directly off trail, bulldozing over several small saplings. It was a deliberate, violent turn, not an accident, and then I saw it, right beneath the rear bumper, where the heat from the exhaust had melted a small, perfect circle into the thin layer of frost. Not footprints, not tracks. It was a small metallic shaving, almost invisible against the damp black soil. It was the size of a fingernail clipping, but it wasn't aluminum or standard steel. It was matte black, strangely light, and when I gingerly picked it up with the tip of my knife blade, refusing to touch it with my gloved fingers, it felt smooth, almost slick, like perfectly polished glass, yet unquestionably metal. It was too thin to be from the bus chassis, too uniform to be natural debris. I held it up to the dim light filtering through the pines. It absorbed the light, reflecting nothing back. It looked like a piece of advanced composite material, something you'd find in aerospace engineering, not a humble rural school bus. What was more disturbing, it felt faintly warm, radiating a tiny, almost undetectable heat, as if it had been recently subjected to extreme friction or energy. This object provided the necessary pattern interrupt. A school bus with a ghost engine and organized missing passengers was a mystery. A school bus with a ghost engine and organized missing passengers, and a piece of impossible, alien-looking composite material was a different category of terror altogether. I secured the fragment carefully in a small sealed evidence bag retrieved from my pack. My mind was scrambling, trying to fit this technological scrap into the narrative of a simple missing bus and driver. It wouldn't fit. The silence of the surrounding woods, broken only by the ever-present drone from the bus, felt hostile, watching. I realized I hadn't heard a single bird, hadn't seen a single squirrel since I entered this clearing. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath around Big Yellow. I hurried back inside, needing to escape the cold and the oppressive quiet. I needed light, real light, to check the cab more thoroughly. I flicked the interior dome light switch above the driver's head. Nothing. The emergency lights weren't working. The courtesy lights weren't working. The standard dashboard illumination, however, was glowing a steady, defiant green around the impossible odometer reading. This bus was prioritizing power solely for locomotion, or whatever process was keeping the engine running, and disregarding all secondary systems. It was operating in a state of hyper-focused mechanical intent. I pulled out my heavy-duty tactical flashlight and began sweeping the beam through the cramped confines of the cab. I checked under the seats again, running my hands along the dusty floorboards, nothing but loose change and discarded pencil stubs. But as the beam traced the contours of the aging dash, something caught the light where it shouldn't have been. Near the driver's left knee, mounted flush into the plastic paneling where a mechanic might install a diagnostic port, was a small, perfectly rectangular housing. It was newly installed, the plastic around it cleaner, lacking the patina of the rest of the decades-old dashboard. My fingers trembled as I touched it. It was a secondary digital readout, about the size of a cigarette pack, flush-mounted and entirely unlabeled. It looked professional, not homemade, but certainly not standard issue for a 1998 Bluebird bus. I braced myself, took a deep breath of the stale, diesel-scented air, and pressed the small, almost invisible button located on the lower right corner of the mysterious panel. The screen flashed to life instantly, displaying vibrant, pulsing red characters against a dark, liquid background. It wasn't mileage, it wasn't speed. It displayed a countdown. $317 below the countdown, in smaller, rapidly scrolling white text that blurred slightly, were coordinates, but these weren't standard latitude and longitude. They were hyper-specific, 9 digits long, and interspersed with unfamiliar symbols, a diagonal slash, a colon, and what looked like a faint geometric glyph. They were coordinates of a place I couldn't plot on any terrestrial map I possessed. My heart didn't just pound, it seized. 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Their countdown to what? Engine failure, an explosion, a self-destruct mechanism. I desperately searched for context. I slapped the sides of the housing, pressed every centimeter of the surrounding dashboard. There was nothing, just the unrelenting march of the red digits ticking downwards. Gent 3, $15. My mind raced through every emergency protocol I knew. Evacuate, call for backup, document. But 3 minutes was not enough time to do anything meaningful, especially stuck miles deep in the wilderness, with a satellite phone connection that was, at best, erratic. I was trapped in a hyper-focused temporal bubble. I had to shut the engine off. Now. The fear of destroying evidence was completely overridden by the raw, primal urge to stop whatever catastrophic event this countdown was heralding. I spun back to the driver's console, tearing off my gloves, the emergency fuel cut-off valve. Standard buses have a pull cable or a large red button near the clutch pedal or the door. I slammed my hand down, feeling along the floor. Found it. A greasy, thick red cable handle, clearly marked STOP. I grabbed the handle with both hands and yanked with all my strength. The cable pulled out smoothly, resisting slightly, and then stopped with a loud thunk deep inside the engine bay. The internal combustion process should have ceased instantly. The deep, heavy thrum of the engine should have stuttered, died, and plunged the clearing into profound silence. But it didn't. The engine note changed. It didn't stop. It didn't slow. Instead, the drone escalated. It morphed from a heavy, grounding vibration into a high-pitched whining keen, a sound that vibrated not just in my body, but in the air itself. The sound was so physically painful, so piercing, that I clapped my hands over my ears, momentarily stunned and disoriented. The bus lights, the small cluster of dash lights, flickered violently, flashing green, then yellow, then settling on a strobing, chaotic blue. The interior became blinding, bathed in an electrical discharge that felt like static electricity crackling against my clothes and hair. I stumbled back, my eyes fixed on the impossible countdown display. $100.02, $49. The coordinate text below the timer began to scroll faster, blurring into an unreadable stream. I could feel the floor vibrating with far more intensity than before. It wasn't the natural shudder of a diesel engine idling. It was the intense, violent tremor of a machine under impossible stress, tearing itself apart or perhaps tearing something else apart. The smell of ozone intensified, becoming sharp and metallic, burning the back of my throat. It was the scent of serious, uncontrolled energy. I stumbled toward the door, realizing that whatever I had initiated by pulling the stop lever, it wasn't a shutdown. It was an activation. The stop mechanism had been repurposed. As I reached the side door, desperate to escape the blinding light and the unbearable sound, a final detail pulled my attention back to the interior. One of the children's backpacks, the purple one with the unicorn keychain, was sitting on the front bench seat, right where it had been placed. Except now, the small zipper compartment on the front of the bag was unzipped, and slowly, deliberately, the unicorn keychain began to rotate on its flimsy plastic ring, not swinging from movement or vibration, but turning, clicking, a full 360 degrees against the direction of the bus's frantic shuddering. It was a slow, controlled rotation, utterly disconnected from the physics currently raging around it. $100.02, $35. The rotating unicorn, the impossible mileage, the composite metal shaving, the engine running without keys resisting the kill switch, and the coordinates leading nowhere. I realized with terrifying clarity that the bus wasn't just in the forest. It was an anomaly that had dragged a piece of somewhere else, or somewhen else, into this familiar stretch of pine and rock. And now, whatever process had brought it here was reaching its climax. I bolted through the side door, scrambling down the steps and sprinting away from the bus, the piercing whine of the engine tearing into the silence of the woods. I didn't stop until I had put the thickest stand of pines between myself and Big Yellow, dropping to my knees behind a massive outcrop of granite, gasping for air. I pulled out my satellite phone, fumbling the call to Central Dispatch, my voice a ragged whisper against the impossible, deafening alarm emanating from the clearing. "This is Ranger Silas K. Code 7. Repeat, Code 7, deep anomaly, coordinates to follow. I need immediate military air support and hazmat. It's escalating. The bus is counting down. I repeat, the engine will not shut down. It is attempting to execute a jump." I looked back at the trees, the strobing blue light of the bus filtering through the dark foliage, pulsing like an unnatural heart. I knew that whatever happened in the next 2 minutes, it would irrevocably change the boundary between my reality and whatever was happening inside that metallic shell. I just prayed I wasn't close enough to be taken with it. I had found the bus. Now, the bus was finding something else, and time was almost gone. The heat inside the bus was suffocating, a humid blanket woven from diesel fumes and sun-baked vinyl. Every sound was magnified, the frantic ticking of the cooling metal, the deep, heavy thrum of the engine vibrating through the floor panels, and the hideous, wet sound of my own breathing, shallow and fast. I had checked the seats, the emergency exits, the storage compartments. Nothing. Just the ghosts of 20 children, perfectly sanitized, perfectly vanished. The meticulously empty space felt louder than any scream ever could. I moved back toward the cockpit, running my hands along the worn steering wheel. The yellow key fob, clipped to a simple, heavy brass key, mocked me in the ignition. It was still turned. The engine was still running. This was the final, agonizing paradox. No one leaves a vehicle running this far out unless they intend to return immediately, or unless the running itself is the intended function. I slid into the driver's seat again, sinking into the indentation left by the last person to sit here. It was a familiar, depressing scent, sweat, cheap coffee, and the metallic tang of fear, or maybe just old bus. I pressed my knee against the lower dash panel, leaning in to examine the floor near the pedals. That's when I saw it, not an object but an imperfection. A thin, hair-width scratch in the faded orange paint of the floorboard, emanating from beneath the maintenance access panel that housed the fuses and wiring loom near the clutch footrest. It was the only line on the bus that wasn't straight, a minuscule deviation in the geometric precision of the vanishing act. I pulled out the multi-tool, my hands, surprisingly steady now that the terror had distilled into grim purpose, worked the small Phillips head screwdriver. The panel was secured by 3 screws, slightly looser than they should have been. Someone had been here recently. I worked slowly, meticulously documenting the torque and the slight crunch of the dry metal threads. The process took minutes spent listening to the motor roar its pointless challenge to the wilderness. When the last screw dropped onto the grimy rubber floor mat, I held my breath. I lifted the plastic access panel. Instead of the usual spaghetti of faded wires, dust, and maybe a dead mouse, the compartment was neat. Too neat. Wires were carefully bundled and labeled with plastic ties. But nestled amongst the main loom, secured by black electrical tape, was a secondary device. It was a small grey box, not factory installed, fitted with a flickering amber LED and a single thick cable snaking out through the firewall. My fingers, thick with dried mud and adrenaline, carefully peeled back the electrical tape. The box was heavier than it looked. It was a satellite communications relay, ruggedized and designed for extreme isolation, the kind of equipment you buy from specialized tactical suppliers, not from a school supply catalog. The amber light blinked slowly, methodically, an ominous pulse in the quiet void. I knew instantly that the bus wasn't just abandoned. It was a relay station. I followed the thick cable with my eyes, tracing its path along the frame beneath the floor mat, past the emergency brake lever, and out through a rubber grommet in the floor, directly underneath the middle of the bus chassis. I couldn't investigate it from inside. I had to get back under the vehicle, back into the hot, oily shadow cast by the immense machine. I scrambled out, hitting the ground awkwardly. The diesel smell intensified. I dropped low, ignoring the dirt grinding into my protective gear, and crawled beneath the massive yellow undercarriage. The engine block, running continuously, radiated an immense, dry heat that made my skin prickle. I found the end of the cable immediately. It didn't plug into the engine or the transmission. It terminated in a specialized coupling, connected to a sophisticated, custom-fabricated metallic enclosure welded flush against the interior cavity of the chassis. It was shielded, insulated, and clearly designed to withstand vibration and heat. I used the flashlight, playing the beam across the enclosure. It wasn't bomb. It was a safe. A very specialized safe, accessible only from the outside, presumably keyed to the unique radio frequency of the satellite relay I'd just found inside. But what was its purpose? Running the engine wasn't a mistake. It was providing constant specific electrical power to this external safe, which was simultaneously transmitting a faint, encrypted burst signal every minute, as indicated by the blinking light. The bus was running to power a communication uplink and to protect the contents of that welded box. I scraped away a layer of dried road grime near the edge of the access panel for the enclosure. There, etched into the dark grey metal, were three symbols, foreign to me, but clearly deliberate. A stylized depiction of a closed circle, an arrow pointing inward, and a broken chain link. It wasn't a gang symbol. It looked like an ideological sigil. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the ignition. If I turned the engine off, I would cut the power to the relay and the safe. That might erase whatever data was being transmitted, or, more terrifyingly, it might trigger a fail-safe I couldn't anticipate. But leaving it running meant the entire operation remained active, perhaps guiding the next step of this impossible exodus. I crawled out, wiping the grease from my face, my thoughts racing faster than the cooling fan blades. I knew I had to risk it. Command needed to know the parameters of this operation, and the first step was silencing the beacon. I climbed back into the driver's seat. My hand hovered over the key. The hum of the engine felt like a living entity, its steady respiration a threat. I took a deep, centering breath, recalling every emergency procedure I had ever been taught, none of which covered this scenario. I turned the key backward, hard, past the accessory setting, until I felt the solid click of the ignition lock. The world went instantly, horrifically quiet. The sudden silence was immense, a physical weight pressing down on my eardrums. The bus lights died, plunging the interior into a dusky gloom filtered by the canopy above. The only sound now was the high-pitched metallic whine of the engine fan rapidly decelerating and the faint, unsettling clicks of the hot manifold beginning its slow, tortured cooling process. Then, 5 seconds after the engine died, the grey box under the dash lit up, Not the slow amber blink, but a rapid, urgent strobe of bright red light. The satellite relay had entered emergency mode. I didn't wait. I didn't need to. I knew that silence, followed by that immediate critical warning light, meant the operation had been compromised. They knew. Whoever they were, the people who had meticulously scrubbed this bus and organized a coordinated mass disappearance, they had been alerted the moment I killed the power. I snatched my radio. The static was thicker than before, but I hammered the transmit button with renewed urgency, shouting into the mouthpiece, not caring if I sounded unhinged. "Command, command, this is Ranger Elias Kalen. I have confirmed active communications equipment on the bus. The vehicle was functioning as a power source for an off-grid satellite beacon. The operation is compromised. Repeat, the beacon is off and flashing red. I need immediate extraction and full federal response. This is not an abandonment. This is an organized extraction or disappearance. The bus is located at grid coordinates." I rattled off the coordinates, my voice cracking with the effort of projection and the sheer terror of what I had just initiated. I dropped the radio, knowing that even if the signal was clear, response time would be measured in hours, not minutes. I threw open the door and plunged back into the dense undergrowth, running parallel to the trace of the tire tracks. I was no longer a ranger investigating a scene. I was a witness fleeing an exposure. The quiet forest had become a listening ear, and I was broadcasting my position. I ran for 5 minutes, pushing through the ferns and thick moss until I found a slight rise offering a minimal view of the clearing. I collapsed behind a massive, moss-covered boulder, gasping for air, the metallic tang of fear now mixed with the pine needles and damp earth. I pulled my binoculars and trained them on the yellow jacket. It was still silent. A dead, yellow monument in the sun-dappled glade. Then, from the extreme edge of the clearing, where the canopy was thickest and the shadows were deepest, I saw movement. It wasn't a person. It was a faint, almost invisible shimmer of light, reflecting off treated camouflage fabric. And then another, perfectly still, perfectly situated to observe the bus. They hadn't come to the bus. They had been waiting, observing the entire time, just outside the perimeter, waiting for the silence. My blood turned to ice. They hadn't vanished from the bus. They had orchestrated the find, using the running engine as a timing device, a guarantee that law enforcement would focus solely on the empty shell. I counted. One figure, barely visible, crouched near a massive fallen log. A second higher up, utilizing the cover of a thick pine trunk. They were clad in military-grade ghillie suits or custom stealth gear, merging seamlessly with the dense woods. They weren't armed with traditional rifles, but I could see the distinctive, bulky shape of tactical binoculars or range-finding equipment aimed directly at the disabled bus. They were assessing the situation, confirming the status of their compromised asset. I dared not move. I dared not breathe. My own camouflage was weak compared to theirs. I was caught. The moment I had cut the power, I had transitioned from investigator to target. The figure near the pine trunk raised a hand, making a quick, precise movement. Not a wave, but a signal. A flash of silver caught the afternoon sun. A small mirror or signaling device. My heart hammered against my ribs, convinced they had seen the glint of my binoculars. I pressed my body further into the cool dirt, trying to will myself into invisibility. The figures didn't move towards the bus. They didn't move towards me. They did something far more chilling. They executed a coordinated professional retreat. They simply melted back into the shadows, their movements fluid, silent, and terrifyingly efficient. They weren't worried about the bus. They had achieved their objective and were now extracting their observers. I waited, paralyzed, for an agonizing 10 minutes after the last visual trace of them had vanished. The sheer, overwhelming reality hit me. These were professionals. This was not a local cult or a panicked parent. This was an organized, well-funded operation, utilizing the deepest, most restricted national forest land as a transit point. The children, the bus driver, they were not victims of a crime in the traditional sense. They were participants, or perhaps they had been efficiently moved by people who viewed the school bus as nothing more than a container. Finally, shaking, I keyed the radio again. This time I spoke in the calm, measured tone of a man delivering a funeral notice. Command, I am clear of the immediate vicinity. The scene has been compromised, but I am intact, confirming that this operation involves highly trained, militarized individuals operating deep within the restricted zone. The children and the driver are not missing. They have been removed through an orchestrated route. This is beyond local jurisdiction. You need to scramble full federal assets, FBI, U.S. Marshals, and specialized interdiction units. Get them moving now before the window closes. The forest is not empty, Command. It's their staging ground. The subsequent hours were a blur of coordinated chaos. I remained hidden, providing grid coordinates and tactical observations until I heard the distant, beautiful thwump, thwump, thwump of heavy rotary wings approaching. The arrival of the federal response was overwhelming. Black helicopters, heavily armed men in unmarked tactical gear, floodlights cutting through the approaching twilight. They secured the perimeter. They documented the bus. They found the relay, the safe, and the telltale scratch marks that I had noted. The experts confirmed the purpose of the running engine. It was indeed a timer and a power source, designed to run until the fuel level dropped below a certain point, at which time the system would begin venting oil and coolant, ensuring catastrophic engine failure and the destruction of the evidence in a spectacular, self-immolating fire. I had been seconds, maybe minutes, from witnessing the disappearance of the entire vehicle. The safe, once breached by specialized equipment, contained a trove of chilling information, confirming my worst fears. It wasn't money or gold. It held encrypted manifests, meticulously detailed maps of the restricted forest leading hundreds of miles into the uninhabited interior, and a single heavy-stock paper manifesto. The documents outlined a philosophy of total severance, a belief system rooted in rejecting centralized modern society, prepared to establish a hidden, self-sufficient colony deep within the uncharted wilderness. The children weren't kidnapped. They were, according to the documents, emancipated from a corrupting system. The driver was not a victim. He was the primary organizer, the willing shepherd leading his flock to a location no satellite could map and no patrol could find. The engine running was not a mistake. It was the final deliberate thumbing of the nose to the system they despised. The discovery of the bus was part of the plan, a brilliant, timed distraction to force a massive, localized search operation, while the actual party, guided by the extraction team I had seen, was already moving far beyond the immediate grid. They had purchased a critical head start. The school bus, the emblem of civic duty and community transport, had been corrupted into a vessel of escape, a symbol of ideological defiance. I was pulled out of the woods before dawn, exhausted, haunted, and strangely purified. I had found the ghost bus, and in doing so I had cracked open a door to a reality I could not close. The official report that followed was heavily redacted and classified at the highest levels. The missing persons were officially filed as a complex criminal case involving domestic extremism and international financing, suggesting a vast network supporting these deep wilderness colonies. The children were never found. The forests swallowed them whole. My career as a ranger, focused on preserving the natural boundaries of the park, was over. I had seen the true boundary, the place where the established world ends and the organized shadows begin. The sight of those men dissolving into the trees, the knowledge that they were watching me, remained the definitive image of my life. Now, years later, I sit here, far from the restricted zone, far from the forest floor, writing this account. The engine of that bus, that pointless, relentless running engine, still echoes in the deepest chambers of my memory. It wasn't the sound of abandonment, but the mechanical roar of calculated defiance. I learned one thing out there that day. The wilderness doesn't just hold secrets. Sometimes the wilderness becomes the secret, weaponized by those who know how to truly disappear. And sometimes the most terrifying thing you can find is not a body, but the chilling evidence of a perfectly executed self-inflicted void. The forest is quiet now, but I know better. It's just waiting. And I listen. I listen for the faint, impossible sound of an engine that refuses to quit. The true work of the ranger is not finding the lost, but listening to the silence they leave behind, forever wondering what it powers. Keep listening. Keep your ears open. Because somewhere, deep in the shadows, that transmission is still running, waiting for the next rendezvous. What do you think they are sending now?